Thank you so much, Steve, for those very kind words, and thank you, Alex, for a wonderful introduction, not only talking about this work, but welcoming us to the university and to the city of Newcastle. And I really want to just also acknowledge the wonderful dance troupe and that fabulous acknowledgement to country that we began the day with. It's always quite embarrassing when people single you out, and I just want to say that none of this would be possible without the team of people who've been involved over the past 20 years, but particularly the team over the last 5 years, because we do it together. And it's an amazing team of colleagues, many of whom you will hear from over the course of this two-day conference. So I have thought today that in the context of celebrating this really quite amazing achievement in education, to keep something going for more than 20 years when often things come and go, as we know very quickly in the field of education. You know, it is an absolute thrill to be celebrating the longevity of the quality teaching model, and that's why I've framed today's talk from intent to impact. I think the reason that we have hung around for 20 years and that we have nearly 300 people here interested in talking about quality teaching and quality teaching rounds is that we've successfully managed 3 key things that I think are critical to change: intent, implementation, and impact. They're the 3 things I'm going to be talking about today, and I'm going to be arguing that it's because we've given really careful attention to intent, implementation, and impact that we've managed to survive and actually go from strength to strength during this period. And I think those 3 ideas are not just relevant to this work, but they're actually relevant to change in general. For those of you who are brand new to the whole quality teaching thing, I'm hoping that at the end of today's talk, you'll go away with a much better understanding of what this initiative is about. And there's lots of opportunities for you to go back and learn more about the basics of quality teaching and quality teaching rounds during the conference, particularly with our interactive sessions that are scheduled. For those of you who are deeply familiar, who've been with us on this journey for all or part of the last 20 years, thank you for hanging in with us, and I'm really glad to hear that it's making the kind of difference it is for you. Really interested in the sessions that some of you will be presenting today. But I hope for those who do find some of this familiar, that there's just some reminders about some of the foundational principles and the key concepts that underpin this work. Where's my clicker? That's the only thing I didn't check, that I had a clicker. I'm glad it's here, thank you. So let's get on with a bit of a journey talking about this idea of intent. I think that to be successful, we really do need to be clear about our purposes, really clear about what it is that we're trying to achieve. And there's this common expression you've all heard: the path to hell is paved with good intentions. It has a couple of meanings. One is that our intentions don't always translate into actions. It's the kind of, yes, I was going to stop and buy the milk on the way home, or yes, I was going to get you a birthday present, I just didn't get around to it. Or for me, yes, I was going to have this talk ready a week ago so I could be nice and calm and relaxed, but instead we're still making some final touches this morning. So the idea of not translating into action, oops, we've just had a little blackout, which I'm sure the tech people are straight onto. So that's one way of interpreting that saying. The other way of interpreting it is this idea that our attempts to do good don't always work out, and in fact can have some quite unintended consequences. And many of you can probably think of examples where there are things that you've experienced where the intent was good, but the consequences were actually quite negative. When I started looking into this, I found there's actually a whole body of literature called the Cobra effect, which is about this idea of unintended consequences. Something's going on here. There we go. The Cobra effect comes from a story out of colonial India. And apparently there was a massive snake plague or in and around Delhi. And what the government decided to do was to pay people if they'd bring in dead snakes. A great way to enlist the community in clearing up the snake problem. What happened though was some very resourceful people decided if they started breeding and farming snakes, they could get a really steady source of income. So not only did they not clear up the snake problem, they actually had a worse snake problem by the end of this experience. And the cobra effect is talked about all the time in the literature. There's another example of this that's a classic one, is in Bogota, Colombia, the capital city. The pollution was terrible, as you can see. I think it still is a major pollution problem there. So what the government decided to do was to say that people could only drive their cars on certain days of the week, dependent on the last digit in your number plate. Imagine if we could only drive every second day of the week. You know, you've got to get the kids off to sport or someone to the doctor, or even you just want to get to work comfortably and efficiently. So what did resourceful people do who could afford to do so? They bought a second car, made sure that it had the opposite number plate, and therefore, as we can anticipate, there was absolutely no effect on the pollution in Bogota. So these are a couple of classic examples. I think we can all think of others. If we think about education, some of the unintended consequences of high-stakes testing. I'm not an opponent of NAPLAN. I think it has value, but we know that it has, in some instances, led to teaching to the test and some other negative consequences for pedagogy. Think about the mobile phone bans in secondary schools. You know, the intent might be good, but we know that kids are bringing in old phones to pop in the pouches so that they can hang on to the phones they really want, or getting second phones and things like that. I'm sure there's other ways they're getting around that issue. And the Rewarding Excellent Teachers scheme that was announced by the former government last year, right away people were bemoaning that idea because we were really worried that there weren't going to be enough people applying for middle leading positions that are so critical in schools if teachers are being given, some teachers are being given extra money to stay in the classroom, plus it could lead to a whole lot of unhealthy divisions in staff rooms, I guess, if some teachers have been selected for this privilege and not other teachers. So again, I believe that idea's been scrapped, and I am a big fan of that idea being scrapped. I certainly believe we should be rewarding teachers, but this is not the strategy for doing it. So, how do we ensure that our good intentions actually have good impact, good effect? I think we have to be very careful to guard against the negative consequences. One of the things that we were very aware of right from the beginning with the quality teaching model, particularly, and I imagine most of you are very familiar with this, the 1 to 5 coding scheme that gives us great specificity and richness in the conversations that teachers can have about practice. We were worried that some people would want to use it to rate teachers. And that wasn't just a hypothetical scenario. Actually, a few years later, after its release, one of Australia's peak bodies had a chat with me about potentially using it as a system related to the teacher accreditation scheme, whereby teachers would have to get higher scores on the quality teaching model to go from graduate to proficient to highly accomplished to lead a teacher. Now, we squashed that idea very quickly because the quality teaching model, right from the start, was designed for teacher development, not for teacher assessment. The New South Wales Teachers Federation was on board right from the beginning and still remains a really close friend of the work that we're doing, and we're delighted to have representatives from the Teachers Federation here today. So about teacher development, not teacher assessment. And most of you would know that in the front of our classroom and assessment practice guides, we have this statement that basically says the guide is designed to support teacher professional learning, and at the end, any use for teacher assessment can undermine its value in supporting teacher learning and enriching student outcomes. So being really explicit about how it's to be used and how it's not to be used was a really key part of ensuring that we would not have any negative consequences from having this kind of coding system with the quality teaching model. With quality teaching rounds, we really wanted to guard against it being seen by teachers in any negative way. We know that some professional learning, professional development is experienced as condescending, missing the mark. Some teachers even feel bad about the kinds of professional development that they're exposed to. It can make teachers feel worse about themselves and their practice. We obviously wanted to guard against doing that, so we were really careful in the design of the quality teaching rounds process, and again, I imagine this is very familiar to most of you, to start from the premise that all teachers are capable of great work, great teaching, providing we provide the right support and the right conditions. And it's something that we're still working on, is how we as the Quality Teaching Academy and the Teachers and Teaching Research Centre can contribute to advocating for the right conditions and the right support for teachers. We see it as a major responsibility of the work that we do. Our starting premise, as I said, is all teachers are capable of good teaching, all students are capable of learning, and it's a really, I think, important commitment that underpins the work. We're also very clear that we needed to provide sustained time for teachers to work together, to do this kind of hard, critical, analytical work with each other. And so we deliberately created quality teaching rounds as something that teachers do during the day, during the school day, when they're fresh and alert and able to really engage with each other in powerful ways, not at 3:30 or 4 p.m. when they've already had a hard day of work. We realise there are some limitations to that, of course, but it's, again, one of our key commitments. We also wanted to ensure that quality teaching rounds was something that didn't amount to what Andy Hargraves has called contrived collegiality. You bring teachers together, they're very polite, very kind towards each other, but nothing much happens in terms of actual professional learning. So with the quality teaching rounds approach, we really wanted to support that kind of powerful collaboration among teachers in ways that could accelerate professional learning. Recently, earlier this year, the Grattan Institute released a report saying that most Australian teachers find collaboration time to be a waste of their time. And they report that most teachers say it's a waste of time, often, because there is no shared vision of practice and because there's no way to adjudicate between alternatives that people propose. Again, this is where the quality teaching model and the process of rounds becomes really important. It actually enables teachers to talk about practice in quite powerful and insightful ways, but also in an environment that feels really safe and supported. When I go and watch quality teaching rounds workshops, and I don't deliver them so much myself anymore, and I do miss doing that, but there's a moment when we ask teachers to get into their professional learning communities or their groups and to start talking about a lesson they've observed and coded. And I'm always thrilled when the conversations just happen so automatically. There's no awkward silences, there's no who's going to speak first or how do we go about doing this work. The process is so powerful that it really does lead to that kind of powerful collaboration. It goes without saying that every child deserves a high quality education, and as a nation we're still struggling to do this. We're still struggling to deliver. Quality teaching and quality teaching rounds are really designed to help. This slide that I've presented here comes from Barry McGaug's work. Many of you would know that Barry was very senior in the OECD and a great analyst of assessment and so on. And what this slide shows is that since 2003, I think that is, 2000, eyesight, there's been a decline in our PISA reading results. And it's not only Australia, it's Finland. So we often talk about Finland as being the pinnacle of quality education. Well, it was up there in 2000, but it's dropped even more than we have to some extent in recent years. Canada's in red, the OECD average in black. And interesting, Poland has gone in the opposite direction. And that's something to do with, apparently, going away from a highly stratified school system into one that is much more inclusive and much more equitable. So very interesting analysis to be done there. If we're going to turn this around, we have to do something serious. We can't just keep tinkering at the edges and thinking if we do more of the same, it's going to change. We really do need more of a, paradigm shift is probably an overstatement, but we need something that really has strong evidence. And again, I believe the quality teaching work that we're doing has the capacity to make that difference. And at the core of it is how we treat teachers. We need to be, the governments, education departments and so on, and society, more broadly, need to treat teachers with respect and to understand teaching as intellectual work and to know that great teaching is possible regardless of the curriculum and assessment regimes we live with, regardless of the social and economic conditions that we are encountering in schools. We have to support teachers to do great teaching. I know that other things matter, of course, as well. Funding arrangements matter. The working conditions of teachers matter. But something we can control in schools a bit is how well we teach, if we can support teachers to do that. Again, that's where the quality teaching model is so powerful. It can help to shape every day that young people spend in classrooms, and every day matters because it shapes their futures, it shapes our future as a nation. So to just summarise in terms of intent, we wanted to create a powerful model of pedagogy, which I believe we've done, and we wanted to develop a productive way of working with the quality teaching model that would be supportive of teachers. I'm really looking forward to hearing from those of you who are presenting to hear the extent to which this has been achieved in your own places. I certainly don't believe we've arrived. There's always more to do and more to learn. So if we go to implementation now, it's one thing to have a good idea, a good model, a good process like quality teaching rounds. It's another thing to make sure that it has a difference, particularly across diverse contexts. We know that schools are vastly different. We have everything from tiny little small schools through to massive schools. I was talking to someone in Brisbane last week who was at a primary school that had 2,700 students in it. It was just astonishing and wrong, I think. There's huge diversity in schools. How do we ensure that our best intentions are not foiled by poor implementation? And we can't just let things happen. We actually have to deliberately make them happen. And that's where implementation becomes so important. Otherwise, what ends up happening is we have this gap between knowing something and actually doing it, and particularly doing it in our own place. We know that, for example, something that works really well at a school down the street may not work in our school. Understanding why that's the case and what we can do about it becomes really important. There's a field that's emerged in health sciences called implementation science. And from the beginning of our work with the Paul Ramsay Foundation over the last 5 years, we've been interested in implementation science. One of our fabulous PhD students, Anthony Ryan, has actually taken this idea and really run with it, and he'll be presenting a couple of sessions, I believe, later in the conference on implementation science. What they've found in the health sciences is that good ideas, medical interventions, whatever, often take 17 years on average to get into practice. We want to accelerate the process of implementation. So implementation science has been designed to think about, well, how do you get implementation to happen more quickly and more effectively? There's multiple frameworks out there for thinking about this, but there's just two that I think are particularly pertinent to schools and really helpful, and these are the two most popular as well. The first is called CIFA for short, but the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research. And I don't expect anyone to engage too deeply with this work, but I think the broad principles are really helpful. So the CIFA, this framework, has these 5 overarching domains of factors that influence implementation. The first is the actual intervention itself, the inner setting of the school, the outer setting in which we're working, the broader kind of social political context, the people who are involved, they affect implementation. Many of you who are school leaders would know that there have been key people who have perhaps got in the way or who have been critical to, really central to making something happen. And then there's the actual process. So just to give a little bit of detail on these, in terms of the intervention, for example, we can think about the source of the intervention. Where's it come from? We know that in Australia, for example, particularly when it comes to systems level thinking, they don't necessarily want to use something that's come from another system. That's one thing that can get in the way. If it's come from overseas, sometimes people embrace it because it's got to be better than stuff from Australia, or if it's come from Australia, people see it as more relevant. But what's the source? What's the strength and quality of the evidence that sits behind the initiative? What are the relative advantages of doing quality teaching rounds versus some other kind of intervention? Thinking through these things can be an important part of having success in your own place. How adaptable is it? How trialable or testable is it? How complex is it? Is it so complex that it's going to take 6 months to figure out how to begin or how to go about it? Is that going to work in your school? What's the quality of the actual design, and what are the costs? Not just financial costs, but other costs. There's always opportunity costs. With the second domain, the inner setting, it's worth thinking about, well, what's the school culture and norms and values? How open, for example, are teachers to having people in each other's classrooms? Do you have a culture that's open to doing this kind of work? How can you nurture that? What's the leadership's commitment and the level of engagement with leaders in the initiative? How critical is that to the success of any implementation? What are the structural characteristics of your school? Is it a small school? Is it a very experienced staff and so on? Do you have a lot of beginning teachers? That also crosses into the individuals. What are the networks like in the school? Because they're pretty critical. Powerful groups of people can make all the difference. What's the climate like for implementing something new? Are people completely worn out, burnt out, fatigued, sick of change? Is this just going to be seen as another thing? So how do you think through how we can see that quality teaching rounds, for instance, can help achieve a whole lot of the school's related improvement goals? What are the resources available? When it comes to the outer setting, we need to think about the economic context, which is a big issue for everyone right now, the political context, the recent change of government federally and in New South Wales, for example, means that there's a bit more hope at the moment, I think, around education and the commitments that are being made. What's the social context like? What are the needs of your school community? And how open will your school community be to trying out something new? What about external stakeholders in the school and the broader external pressures that, of course, are really big at the moment as we still recover from and are affected by COVID and a bunch of other things. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. Then it comes to the individuals in this fourth domain. All of these things can affect implementation. What are people's views? Some people will say, we did quality teaching 20 years ago, that's old hat. Maybe there are people in your school who have some really positive narratives to tell about their experiences with quality teaching and quality teaching rounds that will affect implementation. What's self-efficacy like? Where are people up to in their careers, and how does that affect how they feel? Are they new into teaching? Are they transitioning into a new school? Are they moving towards transitioning out of teaching? Will that affect how they engage? What's their relationship like? If some people have a really strong history with a school, their parents went there, their kids go there, they're part of the furniture, if you like. Others, struggle to feel a sense of belonging. It's certainly an issue for casual teachers. One of our PhD students, again, is looking at the impact of quality teaching rounds for casual teachers, and presenting later in the conference. What about people's personal attributes, their values, their motivations, even capacity? We all have stuff happening in our lives. At times, people don't have capacity for something new. So how can you nurture that? How can you do what I'll come back to in a minute, which is starting slowly with some people, those who are ready. And then finally, it's the actual process. How do we actually make things happen? As I said, we don't just let quality teaching rounds, you need to make it happen. That's about careful planning, It's about engaging the right people. It's about executing it well, and then ongoing reflection and evaluation processes. We need to know what's happening, what the effects are. We need to be looking at impact as we go along, and it's part of a good implementation plan. Tony Bright, who was president of the Carnegie Foundation for a while and a very highly regarded academic in the US, he says that we often implement quickly and learn slowly. And we've seen this often when we establish new policies and say, everyone has to do it from now on, this is what we're doing. And we learn slowly. We realize that it didn't work, it's making mistakes, it's having unintended consequences. The alternative is to implement slowly and learn quickly. That means often starting with a small group, trying it out, seeing how it fits with your school, getting your early adopters, your volunteers to engage first and learn from that experience before expecting that everybody's going to jump on board. There's one other framework that comes out of implementation science that just has a few words in that I think are also really useful, a few concepts. These are about outcomes from implementation, but they're useful to think about at the start as well. How acceptable is an initiative is something we need to think about. How acceptable to your staff and to your school community? At what point do you adopt something? How appropriate is it to your setting? What's the fit like? How relevant is it for your teachers? To what degree can we ensure that it's feasible, that there's a high level of fidelity, that the costs are appropriate, that we can ripple it out ultimately across the whole school, and how sustainable is it? Now, there's a lot in there, and I guess it goes to the issue that implementation is really complex. We can't just ensure that some good idea, like the quality teaching model, is going to just be taken up by schools all over the country. It's why we developed the whole process of quality teaching rounds to help with implementation. But we've also done a number of other things. I'll come back to that in 1 second. This concept, I think, is also quite a useful one. Sally Patfield, who's one of our leading academics in the centre, led a paper that we published where we were looking at implementation questions. And there's a distinction in the literature between performative and ostensive. Don't worry too much about the terminology. Performative and ostensive aspects of implementation. The performative is the how. It's doing the 4 processes associated with quality teaching rounds. You can tick those off and say, yes, we're having a reading discussion, we're observing lessons, we're coding, and so on. But the ostensive gets at the why. It's about the purposes and not losing sight of the fact that this is designed to be something that supports teachers and provides them with sustained time for doing critical analysis of practice. So while going through the steps of the process, we want to make sure that we still have integrity, that the idea, it's not just about fidelity, it's really very much about integrity. Some of the things we've tried to do are to make sure the quality teaching rounds process is really effective. The commitment to confidentiality, for example, among participants is a really key part of making sure that teachers feel comfortable and supported in the process. We also have been really careful to address the diverse contexts of schools. We know, as I said right from the beginning, that schools are enormously varied across the country. That's one of the reasons why we developed the process we call QTR Digital, a fully online form of quality teaching rounds where the workshops and the rounds themselves are done without people ever coming together face to face. And we developed this before COVID, so it wasn't just a reactionary thing. It was something we always knew was important, especially to support people in small, rural and remote locations. So quality teaching rounds designed for those contexts, but actually can be used by any schools where you can't perhaps release 4 teachers to do quality teaching rounds. You can get together with people in other schools and release 1 teacher at a time. We've also seen that the quality teaching rounds process has been successfully used in schools for special purposes, hospital schools, inclusive ed settings, environmental ed settings, distance ed settings, certainly been used across primary, secondary, central schools. We've seen it used with beginning teachers, student teachers, with middle leaders as an important part of helping middle leaders with their instructional leadership role, with school leaders, with teachers and so on. So we've really tried to be mindful of how this is broadly applicable across that full range of contexts. We've also tried to ensure that the work on quality teaching rounds is aligned with state and national initiatives and policies. So for example, and you'll find in your app under documents and links some of these things, there's a document where we've mapped quality teaching rounds to the New South Wales School Excellence Framework. Even if you're from another state or jurisdiction, you can access that document and see how it aligns with your own improvement and excellence agendas. We have a sample for how it can be written up in the school improvement plans. We have outlined how the quality teaching work aligns with the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers, and we've aligned it with the National School Improvement Tool. So these are ways in which we see the connections, and we're trying to support schools and school leaders to articulate the connections with those kinds of requirements. And of course, we also set up the Quality Teaching Academy, and this is so critical to being able to implement at scale. The Paul Ramsay Foundation, when they funded us with what in the end has been $17 million 5 years ago, they wanted us to set up a business model. They didn't want to give us $17 million to do this huge program of work and have it all disappear at the end. So we set up this not-for-profit social enterprise. I want to be really clear about that. It's not a money-making exercise. I need the Vice-Chancellor to close his ears at the moment, but it's not yet making any money. And any money that does come back to the Quality Teaching Academy will go straight back into the research and into the support services that we provide for schools. We anticipate that'll be happening in another year or two. But the Quality Teaching Academy, with its resources, once upon a time, Julie Bowe, some of you will remember, and I were the only two people running workshops in quality teaching rounds. You can't take that to scale. We now have this fabulous team of former and current quality teaching rounds advisors who deliver a lot of the professional development. They're straight out of schools. They're people with a high level of credibility and empathy for what you're doing in schools. And we couldn't do the implementation work without them. But all of these are really important aspects of ensuring that we are implementing well. Let's go now to impact. Sorry, one last slide. That is, we appreciate right now that implementation can be tricky, especially in contexts where you're struggling to find casual teachers. There is another document in the app that's called Embedding Quality Teaching in Your School, and it gives you a whole lot of other ideas for how you can use and benefit from the work on quality teaching without necessarily doing quality teaching rounds. Which now brings me to impact. We know at the core of having impact in education, at least rhetorically at the moment, is evidence. There's a lot of talk about evidence-based practice. Now, we might later today actually discuss what some of the limitations of that are, because evidence can mean very different things to different people. But we certainly are working in this context where evidence is valued, and we have been very careful to work on the production of a whole body of really rigorous, really robust evidence that actually can be held up to scrutiny at the highest levels. We've had our work published in the top journals in the field. We've had interest from people around the world in the work. We've had our work overseen by the RAND Corporation. There's a whole lot of checks and balances we have in place around rigour. Of course, it's been very hard over the last 5 years to produce research evidence in education when schools have been closed and when there are all the other challenges going on in schools. And just to give you a sense of what that's been like, one of the many randomised controlled trials we conducted during the last 5 years, we started in 2019. We wanted 200 schools to participate. We were going to put them into groups randomly. They'd do quality teaching rounds or something else. We'd follow up, and then we'd watch what was happening for teachers and students, collecting more data in the 2 following years. Really nice, neat study design. We didn't get 200 schools in the first year. We got 126, So we did then what's called a split cohort, and so we had another 80 schools come onto the study in the second year, and we had this nice design for how it was going to work, and we could still get the ripple at the other end and follow people from the first year. We had a lot of them, 126 schools. Again, those plans were foiled, and this is what it ended up looking like. So bushfires affected things. 2020, we had to abandon the whole trial. We did get some great data on the impact of COVID, however, and you can see, like, it was tough, and all credit to Wendy Taggart, who was our project manager on this work, who is still with us and didn't completely give up in the context of trying to do this work. Despite all of that, though, we have accumulated a really quite compelling body of evidence, and very rigorous evidence, as I said, that stands up to the highest levels of scrutiny. We've seen positive effects on student achievement now from these randomized controlled trials, gold standard of evidence, in 2 different subjects, maths and reading, at 2 stages. We did, in Victoria last year, try working with Year 8, a Year 8 cohort. Unfortunately, we just didn't get enough schools signing up for that to yield a meaningful result. But we do at least have these 2 stages at primary school. We do have a positive result on, and this is over and above, of course, the control group, statistically significant effects in 2 states now, New South Wales and Queensland, in the fully face-to-face mode and the fully online mode with QTR Digital, with researcher-led and advisor-led workshops, and there was an independent trial done last year by the Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Queensland. So pretty compelling evidence that despite all the complexities, we've been able to see that kind of impact. And it's really quite significant when we consider that where people have shown the impact of professional development on student learning, it's often been using what they call proximal measures. Teach teachers about phonics, students do better on phonemic awareness tests. We are, if you like, teaching teachers about pedagogy, and students are doing better in progressive achievement tests on maths and reading. It's a distal measure. It makes it really quite powerful and impressive to get this kind of impact with a professional development approach that's focused on pedagogy. Student achievement is in some ways the holy grail of this work. When you're doing professional development, the idea is it impacts on teachers positively and therefore impacts on students. We're delighted that it also has really positive effects for teachers. Just before I go there, when I talk about the impact on student learning, it might be helpful for some of you who haven't seen this slide before. What we're seeing here is from term 1 to term 4, partway through term 1, partway through term 4. The control group in the black part of this dashboard is beginning of the year PAT results, end of the year PAT results, a normal year's growth. It's around about an effect size of 0.4. What you see in the purple, particularly the last line on this dashboard, is the effects when teachers had participated in quality teaching rounds. Statistically significant effect, equivalent to 2 months of additional growth in an 8-month period, or 25% greater growth for students whose teachers have participated in quality teaching rounds. That's, again, pretty unheard of in the international literature in terms of effects on students. And just to summarise a different way, in our different trials, you can see that we've had effects on maths, effects on reading, and the effects are slightly stronger in disadvantaged schools. And that is, again, really important to us because we are really committed to seeing how this work can make a difference in closing the long-standing equity gaps that we are failing to address as a nation in Australia, despite all of the best efforts. In terms of the impact on teachers, our randomised controlled trials have shown statistically significant effects on the quality of teaching, which is our intent. I don't know if Leanne's here, but big shout out to that fabulous photo of Leanne Collins. There she is. Effects on teacher morale, which have never been more important, I think, than they are now. Positive effects on morale, effects on how teachers feel about their capacity to make a difference or teacher efficacy. And then from our huge body of qualitative evidence, we also have positive effects on collaboration, collegiality, and school culture. So there's one initiative, typically involving 4 days of teachers' time, quality teaching rounds, 6 days for those who also attend a workshop, is producing all of those significant effects at a time when this is exactly what schools and systems are crying out for. So again, it's really exciting. It's also really humbling and really heartening to see that this perseverance over the last 20 years has produced this kind of evidence. And I think we're at the point now where we want to argue, and we'd like to collect more evidence about some of this, that quality teaching and quality teaching rounds have relevance at every single stage of teachers' careers. We're trying to attract more people into teaching. Well, this work presents teaching as intellectually challenging and rewarding work. And that's what people are more interested in than coming in and being told to do, follow this lesson plan, go through the motions. That's not what inspires teachers. Teachers are passionate people, by and large, who are really enthusiastic about working with young people and making a difference. Certainly it's relevant at the preparation stage. We believe, and we're doing work at the University of Newcastle on this, that we can strengthen initial teacher education programs with this work. And it can strengthen the coherence of programs because students can, if you like, hang all the material off those 3 big ideas of intellectual quality, quality learning environment, and significance. It can help with the placement of teachers in different contexts. So many teachers are working out of field at the moment, and we know that sometimes when people are working out of field, they're one step ahead of their students. But if they can be mindful of how, for example, they need to be thinking about the big concepts and the relationships between them and how to make this work significant, it can just help to distill what's really important. It can help, of course, with teacher induction. Alex mentioned a project we're starting there shortly. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but we're really confident that this can make a difference for beginning teachers. It's certainly important in teacher development. We've talked about that already. It can help with teacher recognition. We find a lot of teachers use the language of the quality teaching model as they go for promotion, as they seek accreditation and so on. But it can certainly help with leaders as well. And we believe it has a really important role to play in teacher retention, particularly because we see so much joy. We hear so much joy from teachers who've engaged, who feel better about themselves and their work, who have that higher level of satisfaction and therefore well-being. So again, really significant part of this work. We've not only had impact on schools and schooling, we've had significant impact on the field of research. I'm not going to go into that now, but the work is really highly regarded, and we're having influence on systems and policy. We were named and recommended by the Quality Initial Teacher Ed Review. We were named in the National Teacher Workforce Action Plan. So having this impact on policymakers is critical, and I think what's really important is them hearing your voices as well. The more that you can tell Murat Dizdar, Secretary of Education here in New South Wales, that this is valuable work, that you value it, the more we're likely to see it extended and expanded in New South Wales, for example. The more that you can tell your own stories, it will really help. There are some opportunities to get more involved. Obviously, you can learn from this conference. We're hoping that's why you're here, but there's a whole lot of material on our Quality Teaching Academy website that you may or may not yet be familiar with. We'd recommend trying it out. You know, if you haven't yet tried it out, send a couple of people to a workshop face-to-face or online and have a go at doing a set of rounds with 4 people. Start small, see how it goes. You can get involved in our national cross-sectoral project on strengthening induction. This is the one that the federal government commissioned and that Alex, who's just leaving, thanks Alex, signed off on last week, and we are going to be ready to run with this in term 3. That project will involve 1,600 teachers in quality teaching rounds over the next 4 years. You just need to have 2 early career teachers in your school to be eligible to participate, and we're defining early career as less than 3 years full-time equivalent. But anyway, you can see more about that in the app, I think under links or documents, one of those 2. And you can express interest in being involved right now, and we'll follow up with you shortly. And of course, you can consider presenting at next year's conference. As you go through this conference and you hear other people's tales of what's happening in their schools, you may well think, I could do that next time. And we will be having another one of these events next year. Last year, I was asked to give a talk at the Australian Council of Ed Leaders Conference. And I talked a lot about hope, which I think was quite important at that time, and it remains important. But we can't hope things will be different in education. We can't just implore people to do better. We actually, as I said then, need to find paths of action that teachers and leaders can take. And I think quality teaching and quality teaching rounds is a very clear path of action that we can take that can make the kind of difference that we've been trying to make. I think that if we go back to where I began today as to how we have been able to survive and thrive over 20 years, where the quality teaching model is actually as relevant and as important today as it was back then, I think it is because we have persevered, and as a team, a huge team of people, we have put in the hard work and produced the evidence. But most importantly, I think we've been able to balance providing teachers with conceptual guidance. So much stuff out there about everything, but 3 big ideas around quality teaching. Conceptual guidance, but also something that's very practical. This is not some theoretical stuff that doesn't feel relevant in the classroom. We've been able to balance adaptability to all the different contexts in which teachers are working. Even university, our Vice-Chancellor came to us a couple of years ago and said, we want to do something about quality teaching in university. Can the quality teaching model work here? And it can. It's applicable to every teaching context. So adaptability, but at the same time fidelity. Because if something isn't being done as intended, we can't say whether or not it's working. If it's not done as intended, chances are it won't have the same effects. So some of you who've been involved in our research would have participated in what we called fidelity checks. We were trying to see if you were following the broad protocols, even though there is that flexibility within them. So that's a really important balance point, I think, that we've been able to achieve. And finally, I think we've been able to initiate quality teaching rounds in lots of schools, but also start to see it embedded from within. And this work, as one of the opening slides up here had when you came in today, it's all about empowering teachers to empower each other. It's not about relying on us. It's not about handing over a whole lot of money to the Quality Teaching Academy. It's about what teachers can do for themselves. Oh, Steve wants money, but as director of the Quality Teaching Academy, it's not about that. Ultimately, my lifelong commitment has been to supporting teachers. And having come from a family of teachers, I just believe that you're amazing people. The work you do is so critical and so important. And I'm just delighted that we have been able to make a small difference, hopefully a large difference, in helping you to have the kind of impact that you seek to have in your schools. So have a wonderful conference, and please approach me at any time. I'd love to hear your stories as we go along.